Let's start adding some of the other controls that we're going to need for our window. Now remember when I double-clicked Game in the menu bar to select it, you can see that the yellow bar has gone around the menu to make that the activated element. I need to switch the activated element back to my layout root so I can add new controls to it. Double-clicking the layout root, and I'm back on my main application. So let's go ahead and start adding some of my fields. The first field I need is a box that will show the user what the keyword is. The keyword is the word that the developer has designated that's the word that we need to display to the user so they can make up words that are parts of it. To do this, I'm going to use a text block. And I'm just going to drag it out on my artboard. I don't need to edit it directly because I'm going to data bind it, so I press Escape to switch out of editing mode so I can go ahead and modify the properties directly. Now my Properties Inspector is still showing me the events, so I need to click on the Properties button to switch back to the Properties page. And before I confuse myself, I really should name my control. I'm going to call this Keyword. Logically enough. Now I need to bind the text of the keyword to the keyword field of my engine. I'm going to use my property marker and tell it to data bind. Now if you remember back when we did the XML, the data field came up by default, but if I tried to bind to the data field, I'd end up binding to a different data source other than what's currently selected. CLR objects work in a similar way. At the beginning, when I bound the word game object to the data source of my application, that created one instance of the word game object. If I were to bind my control to the word game object on this tab, it would create a separate instance, and since there are two separate instances, these would be disconnected and wouldn't be showing corresponding values. I need to make sure I click on the Explicit Data Context tab and expand until I find my keyword. Now you can see that the keyword has got the triangle saying that it can be expanded. If I expand that, you can see that the keyword also defines a length. So if for some reason I wanted to bind to the length of the keyword as opposed to the keyword itself, I could do that. Now with the keyword that doesn't make sense, so I'm just going to click on the keyword and click Finish. In this case, my developer's already supplied a sample value for me, expression, as a keyword. Okay. The next thing the user is going to need to do is to have a field to enter their words into. Instead of using a text block, which is a read-only field, I'm going to use a text box. Now I could theoretically use a rich text box here, but since my user is just typing words and they don't really care what's bold or what's in italics, the rich text box doesn't make sense. So I'm going to select the text box and drag one out. I'm going to press Escape again since I don't need to edit that. And now the user is going to need a button that they can press to submit their word to the game. Let's use the button control and drag one out. Now remember those snap lines that we used before. As long as my button starts relatively close to the top of my text box, as soon as I press the mouse down, it's going to show a red dotted line to indicate that the top of the control that I'm about to create is already lined up with the top of the text box. Now I drag out my button and get the bottoms lined up as well. Now I haven't named either of these controls. I'm terrible at naming as I go along, so let's make sure we do that right now. This button is going to be the Submit Word button. And my text box is going to be User Word. Now some people, when they used to do WinForms, like to preface each of their controls with an acronym. For instance, a button would be BTN _ submit word, and a text box would be TB user word. These are all matters of personal preference. I usually don't like to do that, but you can do whatever feels most comfortable to you. Now I've created the user word, let's go ahead and bind it. Now, up till now, all the data binding that we've been doing is one-way data binding. That means it receives its value from the source, but it doesn't have the ability to send anything back. In this case, we're actually going to be doing a two-way binding. So let's look at how that works. I'm going to click my property marker. I'm going to data bind again. And again, I'm going to go to the explicit data context. Now when I expand, I have the user's string, which is what my developer told me is how the user is going to enter their value. But I need to drag my dialog up so that when I expand the bottom, I can see that there are some additional binding properties. Among them is the binding direction. In most cases, default is what you're going to want, but in this case, I actually want a two-way binding. This means that as soon as the user types a value in, that value is set in my engine. So when my developer looks for that particular field, it's going to match whatever my user has typed. Now, I can't get to my finish button because of the height of my screen, but you should probably be able to see it on yours. But if I collapse it down, the values that I clicked are still set, so I can press finish, and the binding is created. The next area that we need is we need a list box that shows the user all the words that they've currently entered. Let's go ahead and create a list box, and just drag one out. Now I need to bind the item source to my game the same way I have everywhere else. So let's just go ahead and click on the property marker, data binding, and go to my data context. Now when I expand, I've got less values shown here, but one of them is my word list array. The observable collection string, don't worry too much about what that means. It's just an explanation of how the .NET framework associates a collection of elements to an array. So I'm going to click that and say finish. Now by default, the user hasn't entered any words yet, so my list box appears empty. That's to be expected at this point. Now I've got a couple more fields I want to add. I need a box to show what the user's score is. We're going to use a text block for that. Drag one out, press escape to come out of edit mode, and name this score block. And lastly, I need a field to show how much time the player has left. So let's create another text block up here. Press escape. I'm going to name it time remaining block. And now I need to bind the text fields again. So let's do that quickly. Now when I bind to the remaining time, this time I want to expand, and a time span is a type of object in the .NET framework that represents, logically enough, a span of time. But how that time is displayed, there's quite a few different ways to do it. I can display for the user how many days are left, which doesn't make sense in a simple game like this, but I could also display how many seconds or how many total seconds. The difference between these two is the number of seconds is the number of seconds remaining modulo the minutes. Total seconds is the total number of seconds remaining. So if I had 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining, seconds would simply show me 30, since that's the number of seconds or the portion of the time span that represents the seconds, where total seconds would show me 90. It ignores the rest of the fields and just gives you the total value. In this case, I want to bind to the total seconds and finish. Lastly, let's get my score box bound. You should be pretty comfortable with this process at this point. And there we go. Now my developer has entered a default value of 50 here, but I'm sure once the game actually starts, it'll show me something better. Now we've got all of our controls created. They're laid out, well, kind of where we want them, and all the data binding is hooked up. We'll add some visual tweaks later to get everything looking how we want, but this is good for now.